The camera of public attention had been rolling all morning, but no one in the committee room expected the air to change so violently. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, cutting thin golden bars across the polished mahogany desks. A quiet murmur floated among aides and reporters as the witness adjusted his microphone, the faint metallic scrape echoing like a warning bell. Then, with a smirk that seemed rehearsed for maximum sting, the senator leaned forward, narrowed his eyes, and spat out the words, "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" For a moment, the sound was like glass shattering in slow motion. Pens froze mid-scribble. Cameras zoomed in as the immigrant-born attorney at the witness table blinked once, twice, holding the insult in the air like a poisonous cloud. Viewers at home felt their stomachs drop. The room itself seemed to recoil. The senator's voice had carried across decades of coded language, now stripped bare for everyone to hear. Somewhere in the back, a protester gasped audibly. Online, a hashtag formed in real time as the clip hit social feeds, each retweet layering outrage upon outrage. But in the center of it all, the target of the insult didn't flinch. Their eyes, dark with resolve, lifted and met the senator's like two beams of steel. The stillness wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Because this wasn't just a random moment of ugliness. It was the culmination of weeks of whispered briefings, partisan attacks, and viral disinformation. The insult was supposed to shame, to diminish, to relegate. Instead, it became the spark. In that instant, the witness embodied every child who'd been told they didn't belong, every parent who'd fought for a foothold, every dreamer who'd been dismissed as an outsider. A hush deepened across the room, and 1,000 invisible eyes turned toward the person in the witness chair. The senator leaned back, confident he had delivered the blow. But the immigrant attorney inhaled once, gathering not just breath, but history, and prepared to speak. The committee's chatter thinned to a razor of silence. But what was said next left the entire room in stunned silence. Long before the cameras rolled that morning, the battle lines had been quietly drawn. The hearing wasn't merely a routine oversight session. It was a stage where centuries of struggle over belonging and power were about to collide. At the center sat the immigrant-born attorney, raised in a working-class neighborhood where language, food, and stories blended like a living mural of the American promise. Their testimony was meant to highlight legal overreach and civil rights violations, but it had also become a referendum on identity itself. For weeks leading up to the confrontation, partisan whispers filled the halls of the Capitol. Conservative commentators had mocked the witness as ungrateful and foreign. Anonymous social media accounts circulated doctored videos, trying to paint them as dangerous. Yet across progressive spaces, hope surged. Crowdfunding campaigns poured in. Students wrote op-eds calling the attorney a symbol of courage. Community centers set up watch parties, projecting the hearing live onto blank walls in church basements and union halls. This wasn't just a testimony, it was theater with the stakes of real lives. The senator who hurled the insult didn't do it out of clumsiness, but calculation. His advisors believed a public humiliation would resonate with voters who felt threatened by demographic change. By sneering, "Go back to where you came from," he hoped to trap the attorney in a flash of anger, to strip away their professionalism and turn them into a caricature of outrage. If the hero faltered, the headline would be about their loss of composure, not the truth of their testimony. But the strategy underestimated two forces: the attorney's own preparation and the watching public's hunger for authenticity. Every moment of the hearing had been rehearsed with meticulous calm. They knew how to pace their breathing, how to lean into the mic without trembling, how to use silence as a weapon. And beyond the walls of that ornate chamber, millions of viewers, Immigrants, children of immigrants, allies were waiting for a reason to feel seen. This hearing wasn't merely a routine stop. It was a mirror held up to the nation's soul. Could a person born elsewhere but raised under the same sky claim equal stake in the American story? Could dignity withstand the weight of mockery? Was this country still big enough to hold its promises? Each second of live coverage carried these questions, invisible yet thunderous, across screens and hearts. News anchors sensed it instantly. "Something seismic is happening," one whispered off camera as the insult clip began looping on 24-hour cable. Hashtags formed like brush fires. Hashtag stand with her. Hashtag our America too. Hashtag not going anywhere, transforming one insult into a rallying cry. The attorney's face appeared on posters and memes within minutes. Celebrities tweeted their support. A national conversation about belonging ignited before the committee's gavel even struck for recess. Inside the room, aides exchanged nervous glances. They had felt the shift as surely as a tremor under their feet. The hearing wasn't under the senator's control anymore. It belonged to the public imagination now. Each tick of the clock ratcheted up the tension. People sensed something big was about to break. Because if the opening insult had been shocking, the response poised to come next promised to be unforgettable. An answer not just for one person, but for everyone who had ever been told they were outsiders. The attorney's silence wasn't weakness, but a pause before thunder. Little did anyone know, this was only the beginning.
Long before his microphone went live, Senator Gerald Kincaid had perfected the art of provocation. Born into a dynasty of oil and defense contracts, he was groomed for power the way some children are groomed for sports. His father, a lobbyist-turned-congressman, taught him that winning was less about ideas and more about dominance. At prep school, he learned the power of sneer and insinuation. At university, he discovered the camera loved an antagonist. Kincaid built his political brand on an aggressive brand of traditionalism that cloaked old prejudices in polished sound bites. In public, Kincaid wrapped himself in the flag, invoking patriotism with practiced fervor. In private, he courted donors who profited from fear, contractors who built detention centers, media firms that weaponized outrage, and dark money groups invested in rolling back voting rights. His speeches framed immigrants as economic invaders and cultural threats, even as his own investments relied on migrant labor and offshore tax havens. He championed family values while quietly maintaining a discreet arrangement with a lobbyist whose firm pushed through defense contracts for his district. His rise was fueled by television. Producers booked him because he generated conflict, and conflict translated into ratings. He learned to deliver insults with the timing of a stand-up comic, pause for the cameras, and let the clip circulate. Every confrontation on the Senate floor was a stage rehearsal for his true audience, the outraged, polarized corners of social media. His team's data showed spikes in fundraising whenever he owned a political opponent on camera. Insulting the immigrant-born attorney at the hearing wasn't a slip. It was an intentional spark meant to ignite his base. But behind the cultivated image of dominance lay cracks. Staffers quietly left his office after burnouts and breakdowns. Journalists whispered about undisclosed conflicts of interest. Even his allies in the party called him reckless behind closed doors, worried his brand of pugilism might one day collapse under its own weight. He presented himself as the voice of real Americans while vacationing on private islands and sending his children to Swiss boarding schools. The dissonance was so glaring that even moderate voters had begun to peel away, uncomfortable with his increasingly open disdain for diversity. Kincaid's arrogance wasn't just personal, it was strategic. He believed in what his father had drilled into him: attack first, apologize never. When public backlash flared, he doubled down, spinning any criticism as proof of his authenticity. He wore public scorn like armor, mistaking notoriety for respect. This approach had worked for years, keeping him in headlines, ensuring donors stayed happy, and cementing his status as a fighter among hardline constituents. But the world outside his echo chamber was shifting. The demographics of his state were rapidly changing. Immigrant families were starting businesses, sending kids to college, voting in higher numbers. A new generation of journalists, children of immigrants themselves, no longer framed his barbs as colorful. They called them what they were: xenophobic, outdated, and dangerous. The attorney he had chosen to humiliate wasn't just another bureaucrat. This was a person who symbolized very those communities his rhetoric had targeted for years. In the days leading up to the hearing, Kincaid's staff had warned him privately, "Don't go too far. This witness has a following. They're smart. They're calm. They've been through worse." But Kincaid, locked inside his own mythology, dismissed their concerns. He saw the hearing as another chance to showcase dominance, to reduce a complex legal mind to a viral caricature, to remind viewers of his alpha status. What he didn't see was that the attorney's preparation, history, and lived experience would make them not just immune to his tactics, but capable of turning them into fuel. The senator's hypocrisy reached its most vivid point in that moment at the committee table. He called for loyalty to American values while undermining them in real time. He invoked civility while hurling the kind of insult that echoed through every immigrant household watching. He positioned himself as a defender of the Constitution while eroding the very principles of equal protection it promised. The cameras had always been his weapon, but cameras can shift allegiance. They can transform from shields into spotlights. In the days ahead, the clip of his sneer would become more than an outburst. It would be evidence of a worldview crumbling under its own contradictions. Memes would splice his insult alongside his offshore bank disclosures. Protesters would chant his name not with fear, but derision. Editorials would call for censure. His staff would scramble to clarify his remarks as donors grew nervous. Even as he leaned back that morning satisfied with his blow, the seed of reversal had already been planted. The attorney across from him was not a passive witness, but a strategist with a narrative honed by years of advocacy. His insult had not broken them. It had given them an opening, a live broadcast platform to deliver the counterpunch of their career. The senator's overconfidence, the quality that had always fueled his rise, would become the very thing that engineered his fall. But the opponent had underestimated who they were dealing with.
Long before the marble halls and flashing cameras, before senators and sound bites, before the words "go back to where you came from" ever touched their ears, the attorney now seated at that witness table was just a child standing on a crowded dock, clutching a worn canvas bag. The salt air smelled of new beginnings and quiet terror. Their parents had whispered to them on the plane, on the bus, on the train, the same mantra: work hard, stay humble, learn the rules, and remember who you are. They arrived in America with a single suitcase and an address scribbled on the back of a cereal box. Their father took night shifts in a factory, assembling parts no one would ever see, and their mother worked as a hospital custodian, cleaning corridors that smelled of bleach and heartbreak. While other children played soccer in the evenings, they learned to translate medical bills and landlord notices for their parents. They became the family's first interpreter, first negotiator, first shield against a world that often looked at them as though they were temporary guests rather than permanent citizens. Even then, there was something unshakable about their presence. Teachers noticed the way they stood up to bullies on behalf of other immigrant kids. A local librarian remembered the child who checked out books on constitutional law at age 12.
In high school, while juggling 2 part-time jobs, they captained the debate team, winning tournaments with the quiet force of logic and empathy rather than showmanship. They wrote essays about civic duty, about the promise of the 14th Amendment, about the invisible scaffolding of fairness that should hold up democracy for everyone. College was no less of a gauntlet. Scholarships covered tuition, but not living expenses. They worked as a legal aid, tutoring other students and sending money back to their family. Professors recalled a student who sat in the front row, taking meticulous notes not for grades, but for fuel. They gravitated toward immigration law and civil rights clinics, drawn to the pain and resilience that mirrored their own. They interned at nonprofits defending asylum seekers and at government agencies trying to fix the very systems that had once threatened their family's stability. By the time they entered law school, their resume already read like a manifesto. Public service internships, community organizing, late-night calls from detainees who had memorized their number because they were the only lawyer who spoke their language. They didn't choose law as a ladder to prestige, but as a lever to pry open doors for others. What set them apart was not only their brilliance, but their patience. They understood how to hold silence, how to absorb hostility without reacting in kind, how to channel fury into precision. When classmates panicked before moot court arguments, they reminded them to breathe, to focus on the humanity of the case. That composure became their signature, a stillness that didn't signal fear, but control. Years later, after passing the bar and entering public service, they walked the halls of federal buildings carrying 2 identities at once, the child who had once been invisible and the lawyer who now advised on policy that could save lives. They turned down lucrative offers from white-shoe firms, choosing instead to work in an office known for suing powerful interests on behalf of ordinary people. They stayed up late writing briefs for families separated at airports, and they woke before dawn to visit shelters where migrants slept on gym mats. Their calendar was crowded, their budget tight, but their purpose crystalline. Each case they took chipped away at the same question: who gets to belong? They built coalitions across unions, churches, and grassroots groups. They testified at local councils, trained young organizers, and helped design voter registration drives for new citizens. Over time, their name became known not just in courtrooms, but in living rooms across the immigrant diaspora. They became the kind of advocate whose mere presence told others, "You are not alone, you are not invisible, you are not without power." In this way, their life became a counter-narrative to the senator's worldview. Where he saw threat, they saw contribution. Where he wielded fear, they practiced patience. Where he relied on heritage as entitlement, they forged their identity through service and merit. Their path had been a slow, deliberate rehearsal for moments exactly like the one now unfolding in the hearing room. Every translated letter, every midnight bus ride, every unpaid internship in a legal clinic had been a brick in the fortress of composure they now carried within. And on that morning, when the insult landed like a blade across the committee room, it did not slice open a wound, it struck armor forged from decades of resilience. They did not rise to take the bait because they had been here before. On playgrounds, in college seminars, in immigration courts, in whispered jokes at cocktail receptions. This wasn't their first encounter with contempt. It was simply the most televised. As the senator reclined, sure of his dominance, the attorney summoned the memories of their parents bent over late-night pay stubs, of the neighborhoods they had defended from unjust raids, of the clients who had cried in gratitude after a green card approval. All of it flickered like a reel behind their eyes. It gave them steadiness where others might have cracked. They felt the collective weight of those they represented pressing a steadying hand on their shoulder, saying, "Now, show them." Everything about their journey pointed to this convergence: the child on the dock, the student with the constitutional law book, the public servant in the shelter. Each chapter had prepared them to turn an insult into an inflection point, a smear into a spotlight. In that chamber, they were not just one person at a table, but the embodiment of a larger story, a story of arrival, of contribution, of quiet, relentless belonging. The chamber vibrated with a low hum, the kind of tension that makes even seasoned journalists glance nervously at one another. As the committee chair tried to move to the next question, Senator Kincaid leaned back toward his microphone, his lips curling into a smirk, honed over years of televised combat. He wasn't done. "Let me be crystal clear," he said, his voice carrying the edge of a blade. "This is America. People like you don't get to lecture us about our Constitution." Gasps cracked through the rows of staffers and spectators. The insult wasn't just a dog whistle now, it was a siren. Kincaid leaned into the camera, eyes glinting, savoring the moment like a prizefighter sensing a knockout. He jabbed at a stack of papers, supposed evidence meant to undermine the attorney's credibility, and spat out cherry-picked statistics about border crime, voter fraud, and foreign allegiances. Each phrase was built to sting, to strip away legitimacy and paint the witness as an interloper. But across the table, the attorney remained motionless. They didn't fidget, didn't flinch, hands folded calmly, eyes steady, voice measured. They simply asked, "Are you finished, Senator?" The words landed like a quiet drumbeat against the senator's crescendo. Kincaid bristled, his tone sharpening. "Oh, I'm not finished. In fact, I think the American people are tired of activists coming into our halls of government trying to undermine our values." His voice rose, his gestures grew wild. He waved the papers overhead, then slammed them down for effect. Camera zoomed in on the stack, catching the trembling in his fingers, a flicker of rage breaking through the performance. Viewers at home could feel the contrast. On one side of the dais, a man red with fury, clinging to sound bites. On the other, a calm advocate embodying steadiness and focus. The juxtaposition was magnetic. Clips began circulating instantly: rage versus resolve, storm versus still water. Hashtags like composure and who belongs trended alongside memes showing the attorney as a lighthouse in a political tempest. Inside the room, the attorney's allies shifted forward in their chairs, sensing the tide turning. Even a few of Kincaid's fellow senators looked uneasy, glancing down at their phones as alerts buzzed about the backlash already brewing online. But Kincaid barreled ahead, unable to see the larger arc. He launched into a diatribe about heritage and real Americans, voice rising with each word until his throat turned hoarse. The attorney finally spoke, their tone still low but edged with steel. "Senator, I came here under oath to present facts, not fear. No theatrics, no raised voice, just precision." The room stilled, as if everyone collectively leaned in to hear the next syllable. The senator opened his mouth to interrupt, but something in the attorney's expression, a quiet authority born of experience, made him hesitate. This was no longer a simple question-and-answer exchange. It was a live duel over belonging and credibility. Each pause stretched like a tightrope. The attorney began citing constitutional provisions, Supreme Court precedents, and oversight findings, dismantling Kincaid's talking points without a shred of visible effort. The senator responded with jabs and interruptions, but each one slid off the attorney's calm like rain off polished stone. Every time Kincaid tried to provoke a flash of anger, he was met with a patient look, a measured response, or an unflinching silence. The dynamic flipped. His fury began to seem small, almost childish, against the steady gravity of the witness. Staffers behind him whispered urgently, sliding notes across the desk, but Kincaid shoved them aside. He'd built his career on bulldozing through moments like this. He didn't realize the spectacle was playing differently to a country now weary of theatrics. And in those 7 minutes of escalating tension, the hearing ceased to be about policy alone. It became a test of character, composure, and the national imagination. Was America a fortress built on exclusion or a beacon built on resilience? Each glare, each tremor of Kincaid's hand contrasted with the steady breathing and measured gaze of the attorney, etching that question into every viewer's mind. Then came the senator's final attempt to dominate. He leaned in so close to the microphone that his words distorted, sneering, "You people always claim victimhood but never responsibility." The room gasped again. No one mistook the implication. Even the stenographer paused mid-keystroke. It was a line too far, too loud, too naked in its contempt. Across from him, the attorney sat perfectly still, eyes dark with resolve, fingers lightly touching the edge of their prepared statement. For the first time, a faint but unmistakable smile flickered at the corners of their mouth. Not mockery, but recognition. The moment had arrived. But no one was ready for the counterstrike that followed.
The air in the committee chamber felt charged, almost metallic, as if the walls themselves were bracing for what was about to unfold. The attorney inhaled slowly, every muscle poised between composure and power. Cameras zoomed in so tightly that viewers at home could see the faint tremor of a pulse at their neck, a pulse not of fear, but of anticipation. They lifted their eyes to meet Senator Kincaid's, and for the first time all morning, he blinked. "Senator," the attorney began, voice low but resonant, "you've spoken at length about who belongs and who doesn't. You've thrown around words like heritage, loyalty, and real Americans." A pause, long enough for the murmurs to start, short enough to command attention. "But here's what your viewers deserve to know." They reached for a slim folder on the table and opened it with deliberate care. The room fell silent except for the soft rustle of paper. "These," they said, sliding a set of documents forward, "are government contracts awarded under your oversight to companies employing undocumented workers at below minimum wages. These are the same companies funding your last campaign." The committee gasped audibly. Reporters jolted upright, pens scratching furiously. Kincaid's face stiffened, the color draining from his cheeks before rushing back as a flush of anger. "This is irrelevant," he barked, but the attorney merely raised her hand, palm open, as if calming a storm. "I'm not finished," they said, each syllable crisp as cut glass. "I've built your career vilifying immigrants while profiting from their exploitation. You've called us invaders, yet your own investments depend on our labor. You've preached about real Americans, but when those real Americans are underpaid, overworked, and silenced, your office looks the other way." The attorney's words unfurled like a banner across the chamber. Every line carried evidence, contract numbers, public records, sworn affidavits. As they spoke, aides behind Kincaid scrambled, whispering urgently, sliding notes to him he refused to read. The senator tried to interrupt again, but his microphone caught only a rasp, his throat suddenly dry. The attorney leaned forward slightly. "I am here under oath," they said. "Are you?" A low rumble of approval spread through the audience seating. Even a few staffers on the dais shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Kincaid as though seeing him for the first time. They continued. "When my parents arrived in this country, they believed the truth could withstand power. They believed in fairness and dignity. Those aren't foreign values, Senator. Those are American values. You do not get to claim them exclusively while discarding the people who built this nation with their hands and their hopes." With each sentence, the hero's calm radiated outward, turning the insult into a platform. They spoke not only to Kincaid, but to the millions watching. The students in church basements, the union halls streaming the hearing, the parents explaining to their children why this moment mattered. Viewers felt their own pulse rise as if the attorney were speaking for them personally. Kincaid tried to reassert control. "This is a smear," he snapped, banging his hand on the table. "I will not be lectured by someone who—" But the attorney's next move cut through his words like a bell ringing across a battlefield. "Senator," they said, holding up a second folder, "I have here a letter from a group of veterans, men and women who fought for this country, many of them immigrants themselves. They're demanding an investigation into the very policies you have sponsored, policies that strip benefits from their families while rewarding your donors. Would you like me to read their names?" The senator's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He glanced around the room for support and found none. Even the chair, usually a neutral moderator, shifted uncomfortably. The attorney let the silence hang just long enough for the cameras to capture his faltering expression. Then, softer now, almost intimate, "I know what you're trying to do. You want me to lose my temper, to fit your caricature. But I'm not here for you. I'm here for the record, for the truth, and for every child watching who's been told they don't belong." The stillness that followed was electric. Someone in the back row whispered, "Wow," barely audible, but caught by a hot mic. Online, hashtags multiplied like sparks in dry grass. Hashtag truth to power. Hashtag mic drop. Hashtag our America. Commentators on cable news interrupted regular programming to broadcast the exchange live, playing the clip on loop with captions like, "The moment everything changed." The attorney pressed on, their voice gathering momentum without raising volume, a force of gravity rather than noise. They recounted case after case of families torn apart under Kincaid's favored policies, juxtaposed with his donors' profits. They wove in their own story, not as a plea for sympathy, but as living evidence of resilience. They said, "You called me an outsider, but I am the face of America's promise, not its threat. You may try to erase me, but I was written into this country the moment my parents stepped on its soil." With each revelation, Kincaid's composure frayed. He shuffled papers he wasn't reading, tugged at his collar, muttered to aides who no longer met his eyes. His usual arsenal, mockery, interruption, sarcasm, lay useless before the attorney's quiet precision. The committee room had inverted. Kincaid looked like the witness on trial, the attorney like the judge. Finally, the attorney closed the folder and set it aside. "Senator," they said, "I have endured your insults, but I will not let them define this hearing. We are here to talk about policy, about the Constitution, about lives, and on that I will not yield." They paused, and the pause itself became an act of power. Then, like a teacher delivering a lesson, they laid out their closing statement, a sequence of constitutional citations, budget figures, and first-hand accounts that painted an undeniable picture of hypocrisy. Each sentence landed with the weight of a verdict. By the time they finished, the room felt altered, as though some tectonic plate had shifted underfoot. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Even the stenographer looked up from her machine. Kincaid opened his mouth, then closed it, his face the color of spent ash. Across social media, the clips had already been spliced into highlight reels, set to dramatic music, posted with captions like, "This is how you do it," and "A new era begins." And yet the attorney wasn't smiling. Their gaze remained steady, their breathing slow. as though they understood this was not the end, but the opening salvo of something larger. They gathered their papers, lifted their water glass, and took a measured sip. Around the chamber, a low murmur rose, approval, bewilderment, awe. As they set the glass down, the attorney's eyes swept across the room, briefly landing on the camera lens. It was a look not of triumph, but of invitation, as if to say, "This isn't just my fight, it's ours." Then they turned back toward Kincaid, meeting his stare with a calm that had now transformed into command. As the dust settled, the impact rippled far beyond the room.
Long before the gavel struck to adjourn the hearing, the moment had already escaped the chamber and surged into the digital bloodstream. The attorney's mic-drop counterattack flashed across timelines like a comet, lighting up phone screens in coffee shops, subway cars, classrooms, and break rooms. Clips of the exchange were instantly subtitled, remixed, slowed down, and shared with captions that turned one act of composure into a global spectacle. Within minutes, hashtags trended at a velocity reserved for major elections and pop culture earthquakes. Hashtag truth to power. Hashtag our America. Hashtag mic drop justice. One meme paired the senator's sputtering face with the attorney's calm stare under the headline, Storm versus Stillness. Another showed a split screen. On one side, Kincaid's red-tinged fury. On the other, the attorney's poised rebuttal with the words, "Who belongs now?" Supercuts of their takedown ran like highlight reels from a championship game. Major news outlets broke from scheduled programming to replay the clip. Pundits who usually hedged their language called it historic and a turning point. Progressive commentators described the moment as a generational reset, comparing it to the hearings that had defined civil rights eras. Even a few conservative voices admitted, off the record, that Kincaid had walked straight into an ambush of his own making. Meanwhile, across the country, spontaneous watch parties morphed into celebrations. In Queens, immigrant rights groups projected the clip onto a brick wall and cheered each time the attorney's words landed. In Texas, a union hall erupted in applause as a Spanish caption rolled across the screen. High school teachers paused classes to stream the video and then asked students to write about what it meant to them. For a progressive-leaning audience starved for moral victories, the attorney's takedown felt like oxygen. Celebrities weighed in with megaphones of their own. A Grammy-winning singer tweeted, "This is the America my grandmother dreamed about," alongside a photo of the attorney mid-speech. A blockbuster director posted, "Who's writing the screenplay? Because this is cinema." Political leaders added their voices. A handful of senators called for an ethics investigation into Kincaid, while a coalition of state legislators drafted a resolution honoring the attorney's courage. The attorney's inbox overflowed. Invitations to speak at universities, podcasts, and civic forums poured in. Small donors sent contributions to the civil rights organization they represented, crashing the site with traffic. Children sent handwritten letters, some including family photos and stories about their own immigrant journeys. One note read simply, "You made me feel like I belong." Even Kincaid's hometown newspaper, usually deferential, ran a front-page editorial titled, "When Power Meets Its Reckoning." Cartoonists depicted him shrinking under the glare of the attorney's evidence. Columnists debated whether his political career could survive. His staff issued a defensive statement, calling the hearing a stunt, but that only fueled further coverage. Commentators began scrutinizing his donor lists and contracts, echoing the attorney's accusations. In digital corners where Kincaid was once a hero, confusion reigned. Some of his supporters deleted posts, embarrassed by the new revelations. Others doubled down, but their hashtags were drowned out by a tide of memes celebrating the attorney's calm. The cultural momentum had shifted, and no amount of counter-messaging could bottle it back up.
Meanwhile, the attorney handled the sudden attention with the same steadiness they had shown in the hearing. They issued a brief statement thanking viewers for their support and reiterating the focus on policy over personality. Rather than basking in applause, they directed people toward voter registration drives, legal aid funds, and community initiatives. This humility only amplified admiration. Commentators compared it to a boxer knocking out a heavyweight and then volunteering at a soup kitchen the next day. Internationally, the clip resonated too. Newspapers in Europe and Asia ran the headline, "Immigrant Lawyer Schools U.S. Senator," framing it as a global story about democracy and inclusion. In immigrant communities abroad, WhatsApp groups circulated the video as proof that speaking truth to power was still possible. Analysts on late-night panels said the moment would embolden the new generation of civic leaders to step into the public arena without fear. And yet, for all the euphoria, a sense of anticipation hung over the movement. People sensed this was more than a viral moment. It was a fuse leading to something larger. Social media posts began to ask, what happens next? Will there be accountability? Could this lead to real reform? The attorney had opened a door, but walking through it would require collective action. Back in Washington, Kincaid's allies scrambled to regroup, floating counter-narratives, but the optics were irreversible. The contrast between rage and composure had imprinted itself too deeply. Pollsters detected a measurable dip in his approval ratings within days. Lobbyists whispered about redirecting funds elsewhere. Young volunteers signed up for campaigns opposing him, citing the hearing as their inspiration. What began as a single exchange in a committee room had become a cultural watershed, reframing the debate about belonging, dignity, and power. The attorney's name became shorthand for a moment when someone refused to shrink under insult and instead expanded the public imagination. For their supporters, it was no longer just about one witness. It was about a movement reclaiming its narrative.
By the time the cameras cooled and the hall emptied, the attorney stood alone in the echoing corridor, a figure both ordinary and emblematic. The barrage of questions, insults, and half-truths had been deflected not with fury, but with clarity. And now the air felt lighter, as if the building itself had exhaled. In their brief remarks afterward, the attorney did not celebrate a personal victory. Instead, they framed the entire exchange as a testament to something far larger: the power of dignity over hate, of service over ancestry, of truth over spectacle. Facing the press scrum, they began with a steady voice. "What we saw today was not about me," they said. "It was about who we are willing to be as a country. Will we let fear and division define us, or will we affirm that belonging is not a gift from the powerful, but a birthright for every person who calls this land home?" Each phrase landed like a heartbeat, deliberate and resonant. Reporters stopped shouting questions and simply listened. They invoked the immigrants who had paved roads, stitched uniforms, cared for children, and defended freedoms long before they were fully recognized as citizens. They spoke of teachers, soldiers, nurses, and organizers whose service transcended borders, whose dignity had built the backbone of the nation. "The senator tried to define me by where I came from," the attorney said, "but our democracy is defined by where we're all going." The quote would be replayed for days as a mantra. What made the moment powerful was its refusal to gloat. Instead of striking back, the attorney lifted the confrontation into the realm of moral choice. "We do not defeat bigotry by mirroring it," they said. "We defeat it by refusing to surrender our humanity." This statement sent a tremor through social feeds, already saturated with memes and hashtags. Suddenly, the narrative shifted again. It wasn't just a clapback, it was a call to conscience. In the crowd, a young volunteer whispered to a friend, "It feels like history." Commentators later described that speech as the point where the story stopped being about two individuals and became a mirror for the country's soul. The attorney's tone, measured, almost tender, made the crowd lean in rather than cheer. By refusing to be reduced to a symbol of grievance, they had become a symbol of resilience. They closed their remarks by acknowledging those who came before. We stand here today because generations refused to be silenced. Every time a door closed, someone held it open long enough for another to pass through. That's our inheritance. That's our duty. The words were simple, but the images they evoked left listeners blinking back tears. And then came the crescendo. Our country is not a fortress. It is a promise that courage can outshine cruelty, that service can outweigh suspicion, that every child, no matter their name or birthplace, can stand up and say, "I belong here. I am part of this." As the sentence unfurled, cameras clicked like rain, capturing a face transformed by conviction. Even opponents watching from afar could feel the shift. Instead of feeding polarization, the attorney had reframed the attack into a universal truth, one that encompassed their critics too. Journalists described the effect as an unexpected act of moral jujitsu, taking an insult meant to wound and using it to elevate everyone. In living rooms, classrooms, and community centers, people watching felt a deep exhale. For once, the headline moment wasn't just about outrage, but about aspiration. Parents pointed to the screen and told their kids, "This is what it means to lead." Teachers printed the attorney's quotes and taped them to classroom walls. Faith leaders cited the speech in sermons. The echo of their words became part of the civic vocabulary. As the attorney stepped away from the podium, there was no triumphant fist pump, but only a quiet nod to the crowd. But that small gesture, captured by dozens of cameras, became its own kind of icon, a symbol of composure after the storm. In reframing the attack, they had transformed a hearing into a lesson, a clash into a catalyst, and in the end, a single lesson rose above the noise.
In the aftermath of that extraordinary hearing, one truth became impossible to ignore. What began as an insult, meant to diminish someone's place in America, had instead revealed the depth of their belonging. The senator's sneer, "Go to your country," was meant to exile, yet it sparked a moment that drew millions closer to the very heart of the nation's promise. It was proof that dignity, not derision, endures. This is why stories like this matter. They remind us that our democracy isn't built on fear, but on the courage of people willing to stand up, speak out, and hold power to account. They affirm that ancestry is not a weapon, but a source of strength. And they tell every child of immigrants, every outsider ever told to go back, that their voice is not just welcome here, it is vital. If you felt a surge of pride, hope, or determination while watching this unfold, you're not alone. This community exists because millions of us believe in a country big enough for all of us, brave enough to confront its flaws, and beautiful enough to defend. So don't let this moment fade. Share this story. Subscribe to this channel to be part of a movement that lifts up truth over noise, courage over cruelty. Leave your thoughts below. Your voice matters. Together we can amplify these moments until they're not the exception, but the expectation. Because the struggle for dignity isn't over. It's just beginning, and it needs you.